Okay, folks, so welcome to episode 4 of the APPA Book Club monthly series. Today I'm very pleased to have Henri Colt as our guest in this episode. I will begin with the brief bio of Henri, a brief description of his latest book, Becoming Modigliani, and I'll share a fairly brief book review from the Barnes & Noble website, which I thought was really great. Then we'll begin with some interview questions, all of which ought to take roughly half of our time together today, which is about 45 minutes out of the 90 minutes, but we don't have to be exact. And after that, we'll open the floor up for Q&A with an emphasis on audience participation. So, bio. Henri Colt is an emeritus professor of pulmonary medicine at the University of California, an international scholar who lectures on 6 continents, he's lived on 6 continents, about lung disease, the arts, and emotional issues surrounding death and dying. He's a medical educator, philosophical practitioner, and a mountaineer. Love to hear about that later. Dr. Colt is also the author-editor of The Picture of Health, Medical Ethics in the Movies, and numerous short stories, including an anthology of flash fiction, 30 stories about life and death. His website is www.henricolt.com, and his Instagram is at Henri G. Colt, HenriGColt. Book description: Becoming Modigliani, Reg Press, 2024, is a comprehensive biography that delves into the troubled life of early 20th century Jewish-Italian artist Amedeo Modigliani. And we'll ask Henri later, how do we pronounce his name properly? This informative and entertaining biography examines the artist's legend and Modigliani's creative journey from a medical perspective, from his birth in Livorno, Italy, to his tragic death in a pauper's hospital in Paris at the age of 35, presumably from tuberculosis meningitis. So here's a book review from Book Life Reviews. It came out June 10th. The book just came out this year. So did the review. This illuminating biography of Amedeo Modigliani, the Italian painter and sculptor who died at age 35 with a reputation as a Casanova-esque bad boy of fin de siècle art, urges a reconsideration of the artist's life by emphasizing the reality of tuberculosis and what it's like to live with a deadly diagnosis and a wrenching telltale cough, certain to prompt one's ostracization in society. Quote, to hide his cough, he invented for himself an almost hysterical laugh, quote, the sculptor Osip Zadkine wrote. Colt, emeritus professor of pulmonary medicine at the University of California, bolsters such testimony with thorough examinations of tuberculosis, gonorrhea, and other diseases over history and in Modigliani's moment, in Paris's Montmartre district in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, making a compelling case that the artist's consumption of alcohol and opioids was, at heart, a way to control his symptoms. Modigliani contracted the disease in his youth, as his sister put it, quote, the doctor's diagnosis held no hope, quote, and entered the world of Belle Epoque Paris at a time when, as Colt writes, quote, even kissing was to be avoided, quote, due to contagion. Colt takes on the romanticized legend of Modigliani's hedonism and substance abuse. Quote, there is no hard evidence Modigliani spent his days in a drunken and drugged stupor, quote, without downplaying contemporary accounts of the artist's, quote, rowdy behavior. The Modigliani that emerges in this telling is a relentlessly productive genius, given to muses and lovers, all too aware of his own mortality, an awareness heightened as war ravages Europe. Colt balances extensive considerations of the history, treatment, and effects of Mycobacterium tuberculosis and other illnesses with considerations of Modigliani's work that draw smartly from a host of sources, critics, and contemporaries. A chapter on nudes is incisive, as are explorations of the artist's relationships with his lovers and friends. Also strong, his rich evocation of bohemian life and the Montmartre, the storytelling tinged with romance, but never lost in it. Okay, that's a great review. If I wasn't already reading the book, that review would get me to do it. So, Henri, welcome to the APPA Book Club. You're a longtime friend and APPA person. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes. So, first thing maybe that you can tell us is how to pronounce. I've heard Modigliani, that's what Americans usually say. I even heard one person say Modigliani, as if there was no I in between the D and the G. And if the Italian without any personal reference to Modigliani would be Modigliani. So I'm curious, you're somebody who has a lot to say about this. So can you tell us, how do you pronounce his name?
Uh, Two ways. I think the appropriate way is Modigliani, to not pronounce the G,
Right.
but very often, certainly Anglo-Saxons pronounce the G, and Modigliani is used by curators and museum experts,
Yeah,
I guess, to
Modigliani. Yes, it seems
so
to
that
be the more.
everyone knows who you're talking about.
Right. Right. Okay, great. So, all right. So let me start with some questions for you. Um, Henri, tell us about a little bit about yourself, just your interests. We heard about mountaineering, some of your writings, your career, your hobbies, your personal life. What would you like to share with us first? I have a bunch of questions for you.
Sure. I grew up in the United States, originally in New York, from a French immigrant father and a German immigrant mother. And but at the age of 16, my dad decided to return to France or go to France, and so he moved the family there. And I continued my schooling and went to medical school in France, and then started my international endeavors, I guess, eventually returning to the United States, working in New York, then leaving, going to Africa for 3, 4 years, did various things, including medical, military service, combat, other things. And, uh, and then returned to the United States, the University of Pittsburgh and Oregon Health Sciences, and then once more returned to Europe to specialize in laser surgery in France. And after 2 years there, was recruited again once more by faculties in the United States. And that's when I began my career at the University of California, San Diego. And having achieved what I wanted to achieve there, after 10 years, I moved on to another UC campus to build programs, and then did the unthinkable at the age of 56 as I left my job, I retired. And at that time, and subsequently, I was told, don't use the word retire because people will think you're old. So, so I left academia per se to pursue many other interests, including all of the work that I was doing in education, and to be free to pursue my work in global education without having a tie to my clinical service or to all of the administrative work that was required running a department. And did that for a number of years. And today I'm 68 years old and doing this conference from Cyprus
Oh boy.
right now. And I haven't regretted my decision 1 second, and found that I enjoy writing and traveling and climbing, and as much as I certainly enjoyed the practice of medicine.
Beautiful. Well, you've had a really interesting life. Thanks for sharing that with us. Can you look your book? What's unique about your book, I guess, compared to the dozen or so other biographies of Modigliani, as an Italian, I have to say Modigliani, is your focus, your emphasis on the TB, the tuberculosis, the medical thing. So, backing up a little bit, what brought you to medicine when you were younger? What explains that interest? How did that happen?
Yeah, it is. According to my parents, of course, we never know for sure which of our memories are true and which are somewhat fabricated or altered. But according to my parents, I wanted to be a doctor since the age of 5. It was, when kids open their books and see what you want to be when you grow up. I always wanted to be a doctor. And I suspect that perhaps that came from influences surviving my own childhood illnesses, having several very close calls as an infant, and then as a 2-year-old, and onward. And perhaps I was enamored with medicine from that moment on. So I never really gave that a second thought, even though I adored the humanities. I loved philosophy and psychology in high school, while at the same time I was extremely technical. So I had that somewhat schizoid personality of being on the one side, finding intellectualism quite appealing, and on the other side, finding surgery and techniques very, very appealing. And the trick was how to juggle both those things.
Well, you said you love philosophy in school, but you're a philosopher and you're a philosophical counselor. What brought you to philosophy? And then, second part, and maybe you could join these together. What brought you to philosophical counseling? What brought you to
Well, I think,
APPA?
well, I certainly think talking about philosophy. I think early on, I lost friends to disease and suicide and violent death and things like that. So I was sort of confronted with the reality of impermanence at a young age. And I suspect that at least subconsciously, that was affecting me. And I was brought up in a very liberal, relatively unbiased household, I guess, where I was urged to see people and see life with an open mind. That was sort of the preaching by both my father and my mother, neither of whom were intellectuals per se, but that was their way of raising their kids, I think. And then in high school, and particularly moving to France when I was 16, 17, I think one of the first, I didn't speak French actually, had to learn French on the fly. And then one of the first books that I devoured was The Stranger by Camus. And I think I was hooked from that
Did you
moment
read that in
on.
French? You read it in French? L'étrange?
I read it in French. And I
Wow.
still grapple with that very first sentence, because it just means so many things. Maman est morte. It just means so many things in French that are hard to translate into the English. So I think that's where the interest came. And then very, very quickly also at 17, 18, I was reading Lao Tzu, and I was interested in Tao, and became interested in Buddhism and Zen and meditation. And perhaps it was the times as
Going
well.
around at the time, yeah.
It was going around, I got into yoga. It was the thing at the time. And so I enjoyed exploring all of those facets of the philosophical mindset, I suppose. And then subsequently in my work, very, very early on, actually, I was dealing with, I never did very much in the general medicine, benign illness territory. I was very rapidly in life-saving, life-threatening environments. And then subsequently in the field that I got into, I spent essentially almost 30 years dealing with patients who very few of whom would ever be cured, and all of them would eventually die of their illness or something close to their illness. So the word was sort of, I'm with you from diagnosis to death.
Wow.
And obviously that took me into some very interesting emotional territories, especially in medicine. As you know, there are very few opportunities for any form of support for physicians grappling with those issues. And I think that's what took me into medical ethics, and subsequently into education even more. And all of that, of course, takes you down that road of philosophy and meaning of life and all of those standard things that we we want to explore. And I think I just had the very good fortune of being able to work as a physician and have that honor to be with patients in those extremely challenging, sometimes most difficult moments in a life. And I considered it a great privilege that I've always felt very grateful for, and sort of opens you up to all of these other parts of what humanity represents.
Wow, I'm hearing in there the Buddha's four marks, four signs, the four omens: aging, sickness, illness, death, and then meaning. It's the spiritual path. That seems to be, you really kind of stayed very close to all of those in your whole career. That's really something. That's quite impactful, kind of up close and personal, grappling with those things on a regular basis, unlike most of us who only see that occasionally in brief periods of our lives. That must have had a really powerful impact on you in terms of putting everything in perspective. Yeah, I could see how that would work. Fascinating.
Yeah,
All right.
it really did. It really did. And I think one of the, it's so easy to become lost or to get lost, both of those. It's easy to become lost, and it's also easy to get lost. And so especially if you, in my case, for some reason, I chose to explore intimacy with my patients rather than that technique that physicians will often use to distance themselves from illness and person. I did the opposite. I tried to explore the relationship, and not realizing the kinds of wounds that can create, because each loss, I took it as a very personal loss, not only a defeat but also a loss. Of course, I had all of those traps, that the God complex and the ego and heightened sensitivity. So I found myself needing to explore each of those at different times, but without a teacher, without someone to help guide me through those things. And so today, at least, it's as part of the work that I do internationally, or my encounters with young people and other professionals, is I have always tried to bring that component of support into my lectures, into my conversations, and share that vulnerability that I believe is important to have as a physician who wants to be in close touch with their patients.
That's really beautiful. Usually in society, what you're talking about gets partitioned into the category of hospice workers, right? This kind
That's
of
right.
caring, close relationship with the soul of the person, this sort of thing. But it sounds to me like you develop that the moment you diagnose or meet a patient, that you're cultivating that kind of really. Yeah, how does the medical profession receive what you have to offer them about that? I mean, it sounds like a whole genre of work that you could be doing just on that, educating other
Absolutely.
doctors. Is this what you do? Is this precisely what you're teaching on these days, or is that just one component of
No,
what you
it's
do?
just one. It's just one component, because again, I'm also a technician, proceduralist, and so I was just very fortunate that I got into the education relatively early. Once I knew that in my career that I would be in a position to help create change. And I mean, the story I tell very simply, and I think it has a little something to do with philosophy actually, is I remember as a medical student walking behind the intern, and the intern did a lumbar puncture, a spinal tap on a person. And I remember we were all following the intern and watching him do the spinal tap in this very arrogant fashion, not introducing himself or us to the patient, and just doing it, in that horrid manner. And I remember thinking then that someday I'm going to change that. And then, of course, realize that the only way you can create change, the only way you can implement change or induce change is if you play the game and get into you got to be at the poker table to play the cards.
Right.
And so I needed to be in academics. I'm very curious by nature anyway, so I love research and many areas of the field. But it took me into education and becoming a proponent of simulation and the use of computers. And my two postulates, which were, first of all, that the democratization of knowledge. So everything I did, I made available globally for free. I never was driven by money. So I thought that knowledge needed to be democratized. And the second was that patients should not suffer the burdens of procedure-related training. In other words, when alternatives exist, figure out a way to practice and learn before you ever take that procedure to the patient. And indeed, both of those, what seemed to me very obvious, they seemed to me to be just universal truths. I found that the medical establishment was extremely resistant. And so I spent many, many years of my career in direct conflict with authority and colleagues. But now it's a given. Now it's done. Simulation is used routinely, almost across the board. And of course, with the internet and all, the whole question of democratization of knowledge is almost moot. We're there.
Almost moot. Yeah. Yeah, I see a book there just about this stuff about getting close to your patients and this, what we were talking about earlier with the hospice category. I think you could write a great book about that. I'd love to read that, Henri. I don't know, but I don't want to tell you what to spend your time on. I'm just seeing the potential value there. Especially even, I could see a whole market, or this is not about the money, but a whole area, a domain of philosophical counseling for medical practitioners, that this could be very insightful, useful knowledge, speaking of sharing knowledge. Yeah. All right. So what brought you to Modigliani?
Well, strangely, I've always been interested in art anyway. And as I mentioned, I enjoyed the humanities. And so although I'm a scientist, technically, I guess, I've always, or whenever I could, I've introduced into my lectures some form of humanities, a little bit of music, literature, art, and to try and liven up the presentation. And of course, between you and, I mean, you guys, you all know this as philosophers, that you're using all kinds of techniques to keep your students interested, and especially as practical counselors, demonstrating the relevance of this.
Yes, I would say we try to make it edutaining.
Entertain. I think that's a great word. And so I tried to do that in my lectures as well. And in part, I had to do that so that I wouldn't be bored with myself. It doesn't look good when you fall asleep in the middle of your own presentation. And then one day, a few years ago, a medical journal asked me to write an article about perhaps an artist with an illness. And I had already been familiar with Modigliani, and tuberculosis is right up my alley. And so I attacked that, did an article on that. And then later, when I decided to write the book, I thought it would be a very straightforward process. But it was far more complicated than I thought, as I had the opportunity to venture down lots of different rabbit holes, looking for truth and trying to define trying to distinguish fact from fiction, and also I wanted to use a medical through line for the book because it was different, and also because I felt that Modigliani had perhaps there was so much legend attached to the figure that
Prince of the Vagabonds, I've heard him
exactly,
describe that. Yeah.
absolutely, the tortured artist. He was emblematic of the tortured artist, and the one who sacrificed all for art's sake, and that type of thing. And I thought, I wonder if I could look at him the way I look at my patients, an open mind and without judgment. And that's why I titled the book "Becoming Modigliani," not Modigliani and a photograph of one of his paintings. In other words, so that there would be no preconceived notion. I wanted to, just like starting a consultation when someone starts sharing their symptoms and their feelings and their histories. My goal would be to have an open mind and not be in any way judgmental with what I'm being told, regardless of what the stories are.
I love the title. I'm glad you spoke a little bit about the first word, becoming. Of course, that's a Buddhist thing, becoming, but also I see a connection with him because from what I know of his work, he went through stages where, he was influenced by classics and Cubism and Impressionism, but he didn't just go with those things that were very avant-garde. And toward the end of his artistry, he came into his own kind of synthesis of all of those things and himself. He seems to have become Modigliani only later on. What's distinctive about him came through completely toward the end of his work, which was really interesting. He was becoming Modigliani.
Yeah, I think that's what happens to many of us. Yeah. I mean, I know there's always that idea that we need to return to who we were originally, and we're not actually growing into something. But I believe that in part, while shaking off imprints and biases and baggage and all, we are actually becoming who we are, and hopefully we can become so that we are authentic, so that we live in a now. And yes, you're absolutely right, Rick. A lot of it, there's a lot of sous-entendre that are Buddhist, somewhat Buddhist.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think everybody, well, I don't know, you can't say everybody, but most of us go through some kind of process like that. Just through socialization is where we learn that we've got to kind of internalize the norms of everybody else that exists before we got here. And then we experiment with, well, what kind of place in that is me? And you try on these different things. And eventually, whoever it is that you are comes through, hopefully, in the end.
Right. And especially, I mean, you mentioned, for example, what happens in hospice. What happens in hospice, everyone knows that the end is coming very, very, very soon. A different challenge is when the end is coming, but it's not that soon. Yeah. Now we all know that the end is coming the moment we're born. Right. It's just a matter of time. But when you're given a diagnosis, and then it's a question of palliating symptoms or avoiding the inevitable for a certain number of years, knowing that you're on your way out, I think also affects very much who you become. And Modigliani faced that, as a young teenager, or even earlier, he had his pleurisy, but then as a young teenager, he survived 3 potentially fatal childhood illnesses, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, which at the time were both often fatal, and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And at that time, he was going to live his life knowing that it was probably going to take his life
Yeah,
at
that's
some point
fatal.
in the
Yeah.
future.
How do you remember how old he was about when he got that diagnosis? He was a teen,
16.
16,
Yeah,
yeah. And he
15.
lived another 20 years. That's it.
That's
Yeah.
right. Right. Right.
Yeah. I'm sure that influenced his
So
bohemian lifestyle.
it had to affect his life decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So tell us a little bit more about Modigliani and like the main thing I think that you said, what, you know, even what prompted you to write the book was originally that article, which was the medical aspect of it. Tell us about precisely that. How do you think, you know, how does the TB run through? What's the through line of TB in his life as Modigliani? Say something about that for us without
Yeah,
giving
well, I
away
think
too much.
sure. I think the medical through line is that the legend was that Modigliani had tuberculosis, died of tuberculous meningitis, because eventually tuberculosis can spread to many different organs, including the brain, and that he was also a heavy drinker and was drunk all the time and used drugs. And really, the legend was that of the tortured artist, the bohemian artist, womanizing, rowdy behavior, undressing in public, drinking all the time, taking drugs,
Hashish, a lot of
hashish,
hashish.
a lot of hashish, um, and and that myth was continued or built partially towards during his life and also after his life, and probably helped with sales, as everyone wants to own a part of the tortured artist
Yeah. Plus, he
image.
also hung around all these other artists right there. And, you know, he was in the
That's
center
right.
of that avant garde world. He was friends with Picasso and all these other people. He did a lot of portraits of them.
That's
Yeah.
correct. He was
So,
really a chronicler of his time. He
yeah.
was right there in early 20th century Paris, Montmartre and Montparnasse, which was really the place to be at the time, whether it was art, literature, and this was before the surrealist movement and before the second Bohemia that occurred a little bit later when Hemingway lived in Paris and all that. But he was there when art, the whole world of art was changing after the influence of Cézanne and then with the budding influence of Picasso and others. And despite all of that, the man remained persistent with to his own vision of art.
Yeah. Yeah. He didn't adopt one of these isms. There's no ism named
Exactly.
after him,
There's
which is
nothing
interesting.
named.
Yeah.
That's right. And yet, when you see a painting,
Oh, you
it's
know, it's him.
unmistakably a Modigliani,
Oh, yeah.
and
Distinct style.
distinct style that others have not copied much, and that for many years experts said was simplistic, non-thinking, that he had a gimmick, caricature. And only now, when paintings are starting to be analyzed scientifically, are we discovering that there's a great complexity in the majority of the works, and that this was a man who, first of all, he really knew how to draw, and second, had mastered many of the color and line techniques of the Sienese and Renaissance masters that he had studied indeed in his youth, and he brought them all into portraiture. Which, in addition, who was doing portrait? I mean, this guy, he was saying, I'm going to earn a living making portraits of people. And by the way, they sort of look like you, but not really.
Yeah. It's
I
very
think that took a lot of
fascinating.
guts. Took a lot of
Fascinating.
guts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. This style is
So,
an element of classical representationalism, but it's also distorted with the long necks and the long faces. Some of that comes from that African mask thing. You know, there's
that's
all these
right.
interesting elements in there. The playing around with colors that would be like adding this little new thing to the classical thing. He took little bits of different things and made them his own
That's right.
without,
That's
yeah.
right. So
Really fascinating.
he certainly appropriated some things, as you said. He appropriated the ball masks from Africa, those long faces and the long nose. He appropriated the cyclitic art from the ancient Greece, with his shapes and curves. And there's so many curves in his paintings. A lot of the lines are actually curves and ovals. And then his color choices are very Renaissance art.
Yeah.
And as I said, he used portraiture when people were not making portraits.
That's amazing.
And so I think that from an
Especially
artistic
these
standpoint,
this sort of distorted faces, but they would capture something of the person's psyche. Like it
that's
seemed
right.
like he really did something. He had some kind of a gift in that regard.
Well, one of his colleagues had said that the reason all the faces and the necks are distorted is because it's the way he saw them through the curvature of a absinthe bottle, of a liquor bottle, when he was stone drunk. But I think it's simply that's the style that he developed. And others have also said that each painting of Modigliani was a silent conversation, that he had to have a meditation before beginning a painting, and that what came out, yes, of course, it's a portrait, but he's depicting he's not trying to do a photographic type representation of his subject. He's painting his subject, but the way he is feeling or seeing that subject. And that was very unique. And he pulled it off. And in truth, again, the legend said that he was impoverished and unknown, but he was actually quite known. If you think about it,
by everybody in the circle there.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
and he had many exhibits, and he was exhibiting along with the greatest names of the time, Derain and Matisse, and Picasso, and
one of his exhibits got shut down by the police immediately because he had provocative nudes right there in the front window. One of the things he's the first to have done was pubic hairs in his art, of like the Venus, all of his paintings of women lying down and whatnot. He's the first to do that.
That's right. That was something
revolutionary. Yeah.
And certainly if I could ask Modigliani a couple questions, one of them would be, why all of a sudden, I mean, he had been drawing nudes. He drew nudes all the time.
Right.
But why all of a sudden did you embark on a series of 20 or so paintings of nude women, and not small nudes? What was unique about his paintings is these were in-your-face nudes.
Yeah,
a 5 foot long painting where the female body
takes up the majority of the canvas.
That's right, and alone, almost triumphant, and that was very different. And even though pubic hairs had been shown in other paintings, no one had really.
Thought he was the first.
No, pubic hairs existed in several other painters would have pubic hairs, but no one had done it quite as in your face,
okay.
At that size when you're standing 2 feet away from a painting. And we don't know why he embarked on that. It was over a very short time, about a year and a half. He did all of those, and as you know, two nudes are among the 4 most expensive paintings ever sold at auction in the world. 2 of them are Modigliani nudes. So there must be something about them that people like, because we're talking about 157 and 170 million each. So
amazing. Sorry, I have a loud thing going on, like tree chopping or something. I hope it's not coming through. But I read that most museums can't even afford to buy a Modigliani. That's how good his stuff is pulling in now.
That's correct, and many paintings are still in private collections and have not appeared at auction.
Yeah, I heard
there are many drawings. He's probably one of the most faked artists around. So there are many fakes, and there's a whole story about why that may have happened and whether paintings were actually done and signed in his name shortly after his death in order to create a good financial environment for dealers and collectors. And so there's a very long, complicated history around Modigliani and what's original and what's not original. I don't get into that at all. I hardly get into that in the book. I'm more interested in the man and the times, because not only would he have been affected by the illnesses that he had and the idea that he would die from the tuberculosis, but he was also impacted, I believe, by his relationships and, of course, later by the First World War. But we don't know how, because he didn't leave a diary and he didn't speak very much. And no one tells us what he was thinking at the time.
Yeah, yeah. And the woman who loved him toward the end of his life, she committed suicide right after he died. So
That's correct.
she wasn't around to be interviewed.
No, that's right.
That's a shame. She was 9 months pregnant. She threw herself out of a fifth-story window, I think, is what I read.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that Modigliani had at least 3 very interesting love relationships, in addition to whatever adventures he was having as a probably relatively promiscuous young man living in Paris at the time. He had at least what appears from his standpoint, because of a letter or so, a love relationship with the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, who is today proclaimed perhaps to be, if not the greatest, one of the greatest Russian poets. And then after that, he had a 2-year relationship with a British modernist, Beatrice Hastings, who I find quite fascinating. She was a feminist before her time. She was modernist. She wrote many different styles using many different pen names. She wrote for a magazine called The New Age, who the editor of which was her lover, her ex-lover, I should say. And because the magazine didn't always have enough contributors, she would write articles under different pen names, and she would even contradict herself and create debates between different articles, but under the different pen names, but she was writing everything. So she was pretty cool. Rick, I've lost your microphone.
Sorry, I shut it off because the tree cutting was, and I shut
sure.
the window, so now we're good. I can leave the mic open. Yeah, that's very funny. The
And his third, as you say, was Jean Hébuterne, who was, let's see, she was 18, he was 35. Yeah. So there was a big age difference there.
She adored him. She took to him immediately. Yeah.
It appears that she took to him right away, but there's something not right in that relationship. And that's the great mystery. But of course, it was romanticized. And he had a child with her, did not recognize that child. He did not marry her. And when he died, she was 9 months pregnant with his second child. But just a few days after he died, she was at her parents' house and flung herself from a 5th-story window and killed herself and her child. Yeah, leaving their daughter an orphan, less than the age of 2. Yeah. So something was not right there.
Yeah, it's a shame. Well, we're roughly at the halfway mark. Before we turn it over to Q&A, is there anything else that you would like to share about Modigliani? Or from
I think only that what I tried to do in terms of becoming, one of the reasons I go into some detail, not only about the different illnesses, and I had at being a physician, I was able to find the medical record and the death records. I had access through the medical library to a few things. And also, just because someone says you've died from tuberculous meningitis doesn't mean that's true in the absence of proof, and there is no proof.
Okay.
But what I also wanted to do is I wanted to, there are always many questions that are raised. Well, if he had tuberculosis, wasn't he contagious? And if he drank, how could he be producing so much art? And if he took drugs, that's illegal. And so I got it. So in the book, I explained that, first of all, hashish was legal and very commonly used in the early 20th century. And I explained also that if he had a cough and if he had chronic symptoms, which today we know about 80% of people with tuberculosis have chronic symptoms, he may have been controlling some of that. And early on, the best way to control cough was opiates. And there's nothing that would make me think that he didn't receive opiates as a young man. And we know the danger of giving opiates to young people today, because that's how you get hooked. And the same would go with alcohol, which is a cough suppressant. And it's very possible that he started drinking to suppress a cough, but then there too, it was no longer drinking to suppress the cough. It was drinking for the effects of alcohol and everything we know about alcohol use disorder today, but which we did not know back then. So I think it's a combination of things. And despite all of that, and then the war, where he's an Italian in Paris and not serving, that must have been felt in some way, shape, or form. And despite all that, he remained, I believe, extremely productive. So he was probably a high-functioning alcoholic. But I believe that there was a demonstration of resilience there, that despite all these things going on in his life and that he was doing to himself, whatever self-destruction was ongoing, he was still resilient in the sense that he pursued his vision of art and remained faithful to his vision of portraiture and chronicling his times through portraiture.
Yeah. Fascinating study. All right, Henri, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience now. Anybody who wants to can, let me change the view here, bring back the gallery view. Just raise your actual hand or your Zoom hand and ask away. Lou, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Hello, Henry. How are you?
Hi, Lou.
Hi. Hello, Rick. Nice to see you, and thank you.
It's
Very,
great to see you.
very interesting book, and also your recounting of some of your life experience. So you already answered. I had two questions, just preliminary, and one of them you answered in the course of things, which was how you come to be speaking French with an English accent because you have a French name. So we call you, the technical term in the US or in Francophile cultures would be Français manqué. We have a bunch of Acadians in New England who came from Canada and have French names but are Anglophone. And so you sound like that, but I always thought you were French to begin with, since you still retain Henri. So surely other people have thought that you are originally French by
That's correct.
language.
Sure.
Isn't that so?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So that was all answered in a neat way. I guess the second question is, it's partly trivial, but there's a deeper thing going on. And I don't know if you or Rick are able to shine a light on this, but you mentioned twice now this very sad story of his young lover who, the age difference, by the way, at that time was not so big a deal. We have other examples: Picasso, Bertrand Russell, Pablo Casals at 80 marrying a 20-year-old. I mean, this was not uncommon among artistic geniuses. So I think that is less scandalous than it might otherwise appear. But this thing that she did to commit suicide, we know, you know, surely there's even a verb for it. They call it defenestration in French, right?
That's right.
Defenestrating yourself. I mean, the French have taken this to a high level to give it a specific name, defenestrate. Do you know anything about this and how that comes out? When there are postmodernists who also, quite famously, there's one or two who defenestrated themselves at a young age. Can you speak to this a little bit? I mean, it's a curious thing medically and also philosophically. Why would people choose such a horrible way to die? It seems to me it's pretty awful.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the defenestration component, but certainly if we were to try to examine her reasons for doing this, we know that the relationships with her family were difficult, to say the least, that they were unaccepting of Modigliani because of financial and religious reasons. And what we don't really know is what her personality was truly like. Apparently, did not speak much. I guess what I tried, I don't get into that at all in the book because the book is about becoming Modigliani and not what happens afterwards. But in my opinion, I'm less reluctant to believe that this is this incredible love story and that she threw herself out of her parents' window solely because she had lost her lover and the father of her children. There has to be something else that was going on, and there could be so many different things. And I think it would make for a very interesting study, actually.
Yeah.
You bring up a really interesting question. I mean, that's something I think that's a great idea to try to explore. What is the potential cause of defenestration in the case of Jean Hubert-Thérèse? It's interesting.
As a phenomenon, just on the side. But now,
Yeah.
one more thing, Rick, if I may, if you want to jump in, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's Henri mentioned one aspect of it that I would love for him to say a little more about, which is, I think you were alluding to anti-Semitism. He was Jewish Italian. They
That's
go
correct.
back all the way to the Roman period. You know, we know some famous ones like Shylock or whatever, right? The fictional one. But so, do you know did you find out anything about that? Was that part of it?
No, we only know that the family, the father certainly, and the mother were devout Christians, devout Catholics, and according to at least one colleague of Modigliani's, they never accepted that she was dating a Jew. Modigliani himself was probably a secular Jew, but Jewish all the same. He had had a bar mitzvah, and he was proud of his Jewish heritage, and often introduced himself as a Jew, made it very clear that he was, and had many Jewish friends. And there's nothing to suggest that he ever tried to shy away from his religion. Or at least if it's not a religion, at least from his tribal belief.
Right.
So this goes back to a period in France where you had the Dreyfus affair, and you had some very famous public cases where Semitism itself was being tried in the public sphere, and
That's
he
correct.
obviously did very little to avoid that. Whereas in Germany, you know, you had people who converted almost coercedly in order to become able to show their work, like very famously Gustav Mahler and others, Heinrich Heine too, I believe. But anyway, back to you. Question now about the actual production of this work. I'm going to read the book, and I'm behind. Rick is very assiduous, and he preps really well for these things. So he's setting a wonderful example for us. But if you're writing something which sounds like a touch of literary fiction, it's historical fiction, right? It's your interpretation. You're not trying to do a scholarly biography. You're trying to do something that's creative. Yes?
No, not at all. Actually, my goal was to contribute to the Modigliani Scholarship and to avoid opinion uh, or judgment, except in specific sections where I announce very clearly what I believe are the possible hypotheses for a certain behavior or for a certain way of being. And so the entire book, except for the very first chapter, which is a scene, there's hopefully no fiction whatsoever. It's all fact and an explanation of what is myth and what is may not be myth.
Okay, so but there is necessarily some speculation involved, and but you're distinguishing in your actual crafting of the work between what you can show to be historical and documented historically, and what you're trying to do to connect the dots. I discovered this. I mean, there are always going to be gaps, even with someone who's well known, surprisingly perhaps, but there are these gaps. So there are two ways of dealing with them. One is what I guess now you've elucidated, that you've given some speculative way of bridging the gaps, but you've said that. And the other way would be in historical fiction, just to make it seamless and invent a connection.
That's
so
right.
You've chosen the former route. Okay,
that's correct?
Fine.
That's correct.
All right. Well, thank you for clarifying, because
sure.
it's always interesting, is it not? Was there any surprising? Were there some surprises during your research where you encountered gaps that you did not expect to find in his life or times?
Well, let me interject. One thing that he said already was that he found no proof of TB.
That's right. For example, if we take his, I mean, symptom-wise, he had tuberculosis, but the cause of death may not have been tuberculous meningitis. If he used alcohol, it may have been alcohol-related. There are other viruses and other bacteria that can cause meningeal infections, and there's still a lot of other things that could have been going on. And there was never an autopsy, and there are no medical records because at that time, most physicians did not keep records. And the hospital where he died anyway was ultimately destroyed, and there are virtually no medical records from that hospital from that period. So it's so I leave it open. And the other thing, which I talk about a little bit, even though tuberculous meningitis is noted as the cause of death, it was common practice in France at the time for physicians to write a diagnosis. You need a diagnosis. And very often, even patients who may have died from syphilis, syphilis was not written as the cause of death. So they'd write something else. And I don't suggest that Modigliani had syphilis, although it is possible. If he was as promiscuous as legend says he was, and if indeed he was going with prostitutes and models and in that circle, certainly the risks were there. And syphilis was pandemic in Paris at the time. It was rampant, and it's certainly a possibility, even though and it's not something that one would talk about. You certainly don't go see your best friends and tell them. And very often, and there's the confidentiality in the medical community. And so if indeed that had been the case, syphilis or any other sexually transmitted illness, it may have, and probably in all likelihood, would never make its way onto a death certificate at the time.
May I just ask two quick ones then, since this is becoming more interesting? So where is he buried? Is he in Montmartre itself? Do you know?
Yes, so he's in Père Lachaise.
Oh, he's in Lachaise. Well, that's he got an upgrade then after.
That's right. He's in Père Lachaise. He's in Père Lachaise. He was buried in Père Lachaise. It appears that the burial was paid for by his brother, his older brother, Emmanuel Modigliani, and because it was not. I've been able to speak with people who source tombs, And apparently at Père Lachaise, if there was an outside family member who was involved in the purchase of the plot, there would be a record of that. If it's a family member, there's no record. So there's no record in his case. So it certainly appears that it was his brother who had paid for it at the time.
Sure.
And oddly enough, 5 years later, because his girlfriend, mother of his children, Jean Hebertin, was buried in another cemetery. But 5 years after Modigliani's death, her body was moved to lay beside his in Père Lachaise. And there is no record of who made that decision, nor who paid for it. There's nothing that I've been able to discover through the different sources that I explored.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because one looks at, I've done some work in that area in an earlier time. So, you know, a lot of well-known artists who were not particularly well off materially during their lives were buried in Montmartre, like Berlioz, for example, who was fine.
That's right.
But not rich.
That's right.
And
That's
others
right.
that were writers, and Fernando Soares there. It was not a bad place. It was a place of some distinction, but Lachaise was reserved for the more well-heeled, yeah, at the time.
Yes.
Very interesting. Okay, what are you doing in Cyprus, Henry?
I had never been to Cyprus. Been to Greece many times, and so I wanted to come to Cyprus, and then after this, I'm off to Greece for a few days, but or mainland Greece, I mean. And here in Cyprus, I wanted to see some of the archaeological sites, and I have some interests, of course, also in Christianity and what is real and what is myth. And here in Paphos is something called St. Paul's Pillar, and it is presumably where Paul and Barnabas came. Barnabas being a Cypriot originally, and and the whole history of the different church that is built in this area called St. Paul's Pillar in Paphos, I find quite interesting. And we think that is where St. Paul was tortured or whipped, tied to a pillar and whipped, before then leaving and eventually being possibly beheaded, I guess, in Rome a few years later. So I thought this would be an interesting archaeological site to visit. And so,
sure. And I believe the birthplace of Venus is also on the south coast, not far away from Limassol.
Right. Aphrodite.
Yeah, Aphrodite.
Here,
I'm sorry, Aphrodite.
Aphrodite
Did you get to Aphrodite's birthplace as well?
Aphrodite is here. Yes.
Yes, she's here with you. That's wonderful. Okay, well, thanks. Well, thanks a lot. It's great to see you. And let's see if anyone else wants to jump in. Thanks, Rick.
Questions, comments, curiosities, shares?
If no one else has questions, I'll go.
Okay. Yuja, how do you say your name?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Yuja.
so I haven't read the book, but it will be on my list. So I actually have a bunch of questions about just your life and your experience kind of becoming yourself. So my first question was, one of the first things you mentioned was you have a lot of interests, right? The book is about an artist, and you became a doctor, but then you also got interested in philosophy and all kinds of things. So I struggle with having too many interests, and I want to see how you were able to become yourself, being somehow being able to deal with this kind of multiple interests and just just wanted to see.
Yeah, I think that I accepted that I'm a complex, multidimensional personality, and I have a kaleidoscope of interests, and they may be fleeting, and others are more long-lasting. and it's simple acceptance. And and I explain it, I guess, by knowing that I'm curious by nature, and then philosophically, I know that there's a significant influence of Zen Buddhism in my way of thinking, I think, but I tend to see myself as a happy nihilist, in the sense that nothing matters, but it doesn't matter that nothing matters. And so, and then I try to regulate my behaviors as a Stoic. So not so much a Stoic philosophy of life, but more a behavioral component. And then I make mistakes, and I'm unhappy with myself all the time. And when that happens, I think of something that Lou Marinoff wrote, which is that, and forgive me, Lou, if I'm not quite correct, but it's, you can replace an unpleasant thought with a joyful thought. And so it's something like that you had said. And so that's what I try to do to get myself out of a hunk. But it's really acceptance that yeah, I have many interests. What else? So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Can I do a follow-up?
Please.
Yeah.
I have to interject. That was a great question. And I'd be, of course, curious to see how I would answer it, or how Lou would answer it, or how Modigliani would have answered it. That's a really good question. That's a perfect philosophical counseling kind of question. How do you become who you are, you know? That's very deep.
Thank
so
you.
Go ahead.
So, I thought it was interesting that you, the acceptance is this big thing you shared, because it did take me a while to kind of accept that because I've been thinking about am I one or am I many, and I came to accept it. But now the problem is more the practical problem, right? The challenge of having too many interests is you can't commit to any one particular thing, whether it's in terms of time or energy or resources, right? And so, yeah, so I guess that's sort of a follow-up. See if you have any practical suggestions. Yeah.
I will. I'll let you answer that, Henri. But I would suggest that you might want to take a session of philosophical counseling with Henri to get a better answer to that question.
So quick one.
I think this probably doesn't answer your question quite, but I think a level of complexity is added if one's interests or habits are destructive rather than productive. That's when there's a certain urgency potentially to the affair. And if they're not destructive, although one could argue that some destructive ways of life are indeed productive over the long term or post, after death, then everything is just just one more quiver, one more arrow in a quiver, and it's helping you be who you are. Lou, you got any words of wisdom there?
Not particularly wisdom, but I have an amusing anecdote about this, Eugene and Henri. I mean, so what we are is not how we label ourselves, clearly, because what's on your business card is what most people will take you for at first blush, and we all have to have something like an elevator speech, right? So say what we are in an identificational way. But I think there's something liberating in having a manifold kind of personality, or having many interests, and not really even wanting to commit out of a kind of authenticity. There's an authenticity that emerges from a lack of commitment, and it showed itself one day when I was still chair of the department and we were hiring. I was interviewing a quite famous American postmodernist, not really postmodernist, but continental philosopher. Dennis Schmidt is very well known, and he was interested. He evinced an interest in coming to City College. And we were having this very unusual conversation in my office, and it's so memorable. It plays exactly on this theme. And so he said he was really interested in my own work, and that was one motive potentially for him wanting to be at City College. But I tried to dissuade him, and I said, Dennis, but I'm not really even sure sometimes that I am a philosopher. And he said, exactly, that's exactly the point. He said, I don't think I'm a philosopher either. And these are two people who would normally be taken for philosophers in some sort of other public domain, right? And we were having this liberating conversation. I'd never met anyone who was such a well-known philosopher who actually denied, in a certain sense, being one. And I think there's a liberation there. Do you agree, Henry and Rick, that this is also, you become untethered from your business card, and therefore free to become whatever it is?
Yeah, I'll add to that. Lou, that's great angle. Like there's a kind of tacit or implicit background assumption that Lou is speaking to, that you need to figure out what your brand is, what those key things that identify you are. Otherwise, you're all over the place and you're nobody, as if that's a bad thing. When I was a teenager, every time I would read a new book or find some new interesting thing, I would tell my mother at the breakfast table the next breakfast, I want to become an anthropologist. And then like 3 weeks later, I want to become a political scientist. And I tortured her every week, every other week. And eventually she said to me, Ricky, actually, that was what she used to call me. What you're going to become is a perennial student. That's what you're going to become. And I thought that was a kind of insult at first, but I've embraced and accepted the fact that I'm a perennial student. I have an infinite number of interests. I can't really explore them all. I want to learn every language. I want to learn every martial art. I want to do everything. I want to be a painter. I can't. So what happens is the constraints of life will force you to prioritize some of your interests over time. And that's it. You could just let that happen. That's my personal advice to you. What you really care about will emerge in your practical life of necessity, because you have to make choices. You have to collapse the wave function, so to speak, of who you are over time by what you choose. And that's it.
And Rick, you should know, Yuji, that Rick is a pretty hard-boiled analytic philosopher by training, and now suddenly he sounds like Jean-Paul Sartre telling us that our values will emerge from our actions. I never heard you waxing so existential before. Well, there you go. That's just another example. So Yuji, I think, you can take a lot away from this about perhaps the misadventures of having an identity. What do you think, Henry?
I agree. I mean, I certainly was told, and I'm still told, that I'm unfocused, and so, but I think then that there's some practical notions. I mean, certainly in academia, one secret to succeeding academically in terms of rising in the ranks and becoming, building reputation nationally, internationally, whatever, is to find an area in which you are the expert, right? So one can be unfocused and have diverse interests and all that, but pragmatically, from a professional perspective, within the academic world, I think one secret is indeed to find an area in which you are the expert, and truly dedicate time and energy to that, if that's part of a career ambition. If it's not part of a career ambition, then it doesn't matter, I guess.
I would add one little detail to tie it back to becoming Modigliani, becoming you. Just think of Modigliani. he studied all these other forms of art, but then he did the thing with the long faces and the necks, whatever. He cultivated a distinctive Modigliani style, right? And it might not have, been successful, but it was. Well, he wasn't rich in his lifetime, but still, one of my friends, a cognitive scientist and philosopher, John Vervaeke, I'm going to quote him. He says, if you want to find out what really matters to you, think about what you are doing or that you care about or that you've contributed some work to, which you would want to survive after you're gone. Then that's a way of figuring out what really matters to you. All right, and Modigliani's work, of course, has lived on. So, and that's distinctively him. And that's what Henri is saying, try to figure out of the superset of things that you love, what are the few things that really define you or could define you? Yeah.
I love all these ideas. Thank you. Yeah.
So you got some free philosophical counseling today. So we still have about 10 minutes left. Let me get the gallery view back here. Hari Chandran,
yes.
Please speak.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting conversation. I suddenly realized listening to, I'm a psychiatrist, by the way, and tennis is my hobby. So these things come together in my head a lot, both playing tennis and like sports psychiatry and stuff. But somebody that really, in a more succinct way, held these things together in my head is William James. He famously, there's a thing called William James and Lang, whatever formulation. Basically, you are what you do. So what he says is like, you're depressed because you're crying, you're violent because you're angry. Anyway, it comes backwards instead of psychosomatically, it's somatopsychic. And that's kind of where the sports and a lot of the sports psychiatry and elitist sports people and all, when you deal with them, that is the problem. It's a huge problem in terms of executing your, like an Olympic athlete. Famously, the gymnast who, was expected to, I forget her name now, win medals, and she just couldn't perform. I forget the name of it. Anyway, you get cross-wired with your overly trained, expert level performance. Is that psyche? But William James and Lang famously said that a long time ago, that it's what you do that affects your psyche. So you talked about being procedural and very intellectual in terms of philosophy. It comes together. I mean, that's the way the brain operates. But a lot of the sports people, I get into conflict with them because I love to, like, if you're a tennis nut and amateur and you have professionals around you, and sometimes they come to you and they can't stand you awful habits or whatever you have, and they'll tell you something, and I really appreciate them saying that, but they're angry because I don't do it right away. Not even a lesson or any kind of arrangement, just seeing and angry because I don't perform. Anyway, that's my kind of take on my life. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's an anchor to a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy as well, that it's not always necessary to go back and find the emotional feeling source for something or the trigger, but let's go ahead and adopt a new behavior that will get you through this particular crisis. And once you're adopting that behavior, that will help change your neural pathways, thanks to neuroplasticity. And again, you are what you do, and you do, so do it, right?
Yeah, it's very tough to undo when you're cross-wired. That's but you're right. Sure. What you're saying is exactly true. That's the method, yes.
In tennis, a friend of mine who was a very good tennis player told me a story. Playing, I guess, on the court next to her, a pro was playing with an amateur, and the amateur was becoming increasingly angry, manifesting this anger. And at one moment, the pro, in the middle of at a set break or something, the pro came up to the young man, and he said, "You're not good enough to get angry.
Yes. That's what I was hearing from these guys. Because I'm getting pissed off because I said, leave me alone. I want to just practice and do better, but they won't go away. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I would tie some of that back to Yuja about practice and doing. This is what, the choices define you, but your actions also, right? So start doing some of those interests of yours and see what happens to you. All right. So once again, the floor is open. We have a few minutes left. Who else would like to pick the brain of Henri or of Lou?
Well, could I reinforce something Harry just said? Harry, I think there's some science now that illustrates or shows it doesn't take that long to form a new habit. It's a matter of maybe 60 days or so if one does something on a regular basis. So surely that opens a window of optimism for those who want to change in some way their life. If what you're saying is correct, and I think it is, this reverse engineering of of consciousness or cognition. Well, the good news is that one really can change a habit without an enormous amount of effort, but with a little bit of persistence over a brief time. And wouldn't that make Aristotle right, Rick? I mean, going back to his ethics, wouldn't that absolutely vindicate his position?
Absolutely. Yeah. How do you become a good lyre player? By playing the lyre.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
How do you become a good tennis player or a good, well, there's no guarantee, but if it's necessary, but not sufficient.
No, with tennis,
maybe.
it's another problem. I've also
Yeah.
been playing for a long time, and I'm still trying to be good. So
Yeah. It's necessary, but not sufficient.
not for tennis. Maybe it's easier for certain pursuits, but I think one has to have an innate.
Yeah.
Maybe there's also an innate component. Having a certain number of requisite potentialities that can then be mobilized.
Yeah, some people are born with a lot of potential, a greater ease of access to these potentialities than others. It makes you wonder if it's just genetics or if it's reincarnation. I don't know. Yeah, but I mean, you think of, people who are born and they're young and they have this tremendous talent that comes out of nowhere, who knows? But yeah, I mean, Michael Jordan was very naturally, gifted at basketball, but not so good at baseball, this kind of thing.
and the nurturing of it, right?
Yeah.
How lucky, certainly as a child. And Modigliani had that, out of the blue, he says, I want to draw. And the mother, instead of saying, no, you're going to become a lawyer, she nurtured his artistic skills. And rather than place him in a sanatorium, she took him around Italy and visited all the museums. And he drew and began studying art.
Also, in the modern neuroscience, we always thought of cerebral cortex as where the intellect and advanced learning was. The cerebellum seems to be leading in modern neuroscience. So these gifted athletes are much more powerful than Einstein was in their brain capacity. That's the way they see it.
Wow.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Let's see. Let me get the gallery view back. One last opportunity. Anybody who's been on the fence, now's your chance.
Well, Rick, I certainly want to thank you because I know the book is not a pure philosophy text. And I think the work you've done with the book club has been phenomenal every session. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about Modigliani, even though the book is not a philosophy text. So certainly, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. I want to give Lou credit for that because he's the one who recommended that I invite you. Lou, would you like to speak to you want to respond to this appreciation on the part of Henri?
Well, it's mutual. I think that APPA has one tremendous strength that is not necessarily visible on a daily basis, and that is the wealth of human capital we have accumulated in our association. We have some really interesting people who join from all kinds of walks of life, mostly those that offer some form of help to others, whether regulated by states or not, but also those who aspire to do so. And I think that it makes for really interesting members, and we want to create more opportunity for people to showcase their work, be it on the professional side or indeed the creative side, or seamlessly interacting between the two. So thanks again. Yeah, Rick, you have my vote of thanks also, because you're a wonderful host, and I think all the authors are appreciative, and also the people who, you guys who are showing up here, whether you're speaking or not. It's not easy to get people to a book event. We have a lot of quality. I know most of you personally, one way or another, through APPA events or programs, and we have a very high quality of people here who are not speaking. So I hope that you're taking away something valuable. This is, the best things in life still are free in some sense, aren't they? And this is one of them. And just so you'll know, I've been to book launches in New York where you've got celebrities, and New York's a very tough place to have a book launch. Some of you may know this, but I've seen celebrity authors where there were 3 people. They had 100 chairs set up in the bookstore. 3 people were there, and 2 of them came in from the rain, and the third one was knitting. And but the show must go on. So I think that, what I'm trying to say is that we have a very good milieu here, and I think some of the people who are coming regularly are really, really interesting, all of you in your own right, and we'd like to hear more from you at future book club events. Please feel free to join the conversation, okay?
I'll add that a few people who normally come emailed me apologizing that they couldn't make it today and asking if this would be recorded and all of that. So there's more people interested in this than those who showed up today. That's one thing. But as far as it not being a book about philosophical counseling, maybe not directly, but I see a connection between 2 things. One, the way that you try to capture the life and meaning and identity and kind of like who Modigliani was to becoming him. This is something that philosophical counselors, if they spend any time with a client, should have this same kind of interest. And, I think your mind as a philosopher shows up in your work in the book, number 1. But number 2, what you said about your work with your clients, that aspect that seems like what only goes on in hospice work, goes on with you. That's a similar philosophical perspective that a philosophical counselor tries to have with their client, which is to really get to see them and know them. And I think that's one of the most healing things that people get out of philosophical counseling as clients, is to just kind of connect with another intelligent human being who they can really, really communicate with. And this is clearly more important to you in your work than just being the procedural doctor. So I see an overlap or confluence of values there that count from a philosophical counseling perspective. I just wanted to mention that. And then finally, the last word always goes to our guest. If any, you want to plug anything else that you're about to do, or remind people of how they can contact you. I mentioned it earlier on, but the final word goes to you, Henri.
No, certainly. Love meeting new people and talking about stuff and sharing adventures and interests. So please don't hesitate to contact me via my website or my email. My email is easy. It's henricolt@gmail.com. And then there's also my Instagram. Right now I'm having fun posting Modigliani related reels and learning a little bit about how to use Instagram. It's sort of fun sometimes.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the book. Congratulations. It just came out. What month did it come out?
July, I think.
July, yeah. So it's really hot off the press. I would encourage everybody, you don't need my encouragement after hearing this today, but to go buy the book and read it. And thank you. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Henri, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
And thank you, Rick. Great seeing everyone. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Okay. Ciao.
Ciao.